Hello and welcome to Identity Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue, and today is episode 74. The topic today is the Cedarling launch. Our guest is Mike Nunschwander, Identity in Residence. Mike, I never pronounced your last name before. Did I get it even close?
Yeah, very close. Yeah, I say new and Schwander, but that's only when I'm speaking English.
Schwartz has a lot of consonants and not a lot of vowels. And I always complain about that. But yeah, I think being of German, a name of German word of descent is sometimes tough for us English speakers. Okay, well, this is a different type of episode. Normally this is a commentary discussion on all things identity, but every, let's say 10 or episodes or so, I try and talk about something related to Glue. And today I'm excited to be announcing a new product that we've been working on at the Linux Foundation Janssen project called the Cedarling. And so today I'm actually taking off my hat because I feel more like the guest than the host. So, and Mike is going to help ask some of the questions about the Cedarling. And but before we do that, Mike, I'd like to give you a chance to introduce yourself. Why don't you just tell people a little bit about your background and how you got pivoted into identity?
Sure. Yeah, I've been doing identity really since the beginning. I started at Intel, but quickly made it to Novell and was the product manager for a number of their identity products, including Identity Manager and Directory Services and that. Spent about 8 years, I think, at Burton Group as research director there, and then have done some consulting and product management work throughout the industry in the meantime. So currently working with TechVision on analyst work, essentially. And yeah, and so I've been kind of doing things in the industry for quite a while. And I know you and others from a many different number of conferences, IAWs or wherever else that we happen to meet. And so we got talking about this one day and it seemed like a really good topic for both of us to get in on.
Yeah, so authorization is sort of our specialty focus this year on the live stream, and so yesterday we had a chance to brainstorm this episode, and at the end of that episode, you asked for a story version of the Cedarling, and I actually endeavored to write the story of Cedarling actually kind of informally, and so I was wondering, can I start there, and that might maybe give us some good background for what this Cedarling thing is.
Let's hear the story. Yeah.
The hero's journey of the Cedarling. So our protagonist of this journey is like an enterprise customer. Actually, it's kind of a tricky question because as we discussed in the last episode, that could be a developer, it could be an auditor, it could be a CISO. But let's just say generically the protagonist is like an enterprise. And I can tell you, like, where we started this authorization journey at Glue, it might have been even longer ago, because when we first started Glue in 2009, we always wanted to build open source SiteMinder, and SiteMinder included both authentication and authorization. Although we've been sidetracked on identity for so long, but recently we were working with a customer who was doing a ForgeRock replacement, and ForgeRock has this feature called transactional tokens. They're basically tokens that get issued one time, and it's all centralized. And so what you can revoke the token, but we wanted to come up with some type of more decentralized solution for this one-time token use case. And that got us really looking at some new possibilities for doing real-time enforcement. But there were a bunch of other challenges that I would say we see enterprises struggling with. One of those challenges is around MFA policies, which you think would be solved by now, but we still run into cases where customers are saying, okay, how do I make a policy that says when they do a token transfer, they must present a pass key with a device-bound key? So there's all sorts of like new situations in MFA that are coming up. And we actually see customers struggling with these which they think of as authentication problems, but really turn out to be authorization problems, because they're normally like, we want more proof of identity at this point to authorize this thing. We also saw customers expressing like challenges around how do we manage workload policies. So we have a lot of, typically we've had people who are authorized to do things generally through roles, which are governed, through IAG systems. But we're seeing a new policy of like a workload authorization. Like, how do we actually, this process is calling this process or this API, and there's no person even involved. How do we write policies and manage policies for that? So that was a challenge. We saw customers wondering about how do they, if they're interested in authorization, how do they reach back and actually integrate some of those older legacy applications that they can't touch anymore? They can't change the authorization, but how do they integrate those older applications into their existing centralized, externalized policy management review governance infrastructure? And I guess, finally, I'll just say we see customers struggling with zero trust. Whether they say they're doing zero trust or not, what I see is that customers they know that they have various parts in the enterprise where they need to enforce security policies at authentication time, during important transactions, and they're figuring out how do they manage. I just call it zero trust. I think customers are still struggling with zero trust. And not to pick on the phone industry, but I think it's gotten so bad that we can see that this has resulted in failed intrusion detection. So literally the US government is now telling its citizens that they can't trust OTP codes and they should use encrypted messaging apps like Signal, because you can't trust the phone company. It's so thoroughly infiltrated, they don't even know how to uninfiltrate it. And you have to ask yourself why. And I would just say the reason why is obviously we don't have enough logs to feed those intrusion detection systems in order for them to detect the hackers.
Yeah, that's a complete fail. This idea of trust, I think we'll come back to in a moment, because we're going to talk about something that Fingerling is kind of on the client side, embeddable, as you mentioned. Something that came up while you were talking got me thinking that you mentioned that in MFA scenarios, oftentimes you'll need to essentially step up your authentication. But in a way, because there's a policy behind that, there's something about this idea of having policy that it's almost always authorization when there's a policy involved, right? Because it seems to me that authentication doesn't really always have these rules.
Yeah.
It's like when you're actually in the moment of trying to access something, then all the conditions need to be kind of figured out at that time. Is that wacky, or is that kind of something?
It's not wacky at all. In fact, I feel like sometimes people forgot that this was already solved by SiteMinder like years ago. We already figured out that stepped up authentication was authorization. It was a type of policy. You have a resource you're protecting, and your policy says it requires this authorization. Your current authorization is not enough. Therefore, you need to send for reauthentication. So there's an authentication piece there, but ultimately it's an authorization policy that defines what's the required authentication metadata that's required to do this particular transaction. I think that's true. And I think that, the fact that we're seeing backtracking on what's 2FA, passkeys are not 2FA if they're synced. There's a lot of nuance in the authentication market. How old was that authentication? Was it a passkey authentication from last year? So there's a lot of metadata that goes into an authorization decision about, who is that person, and do I trust that assertion, and what was the mechanism through which the authenticator that was used for that authentication.
Well, this is essentially getting into the heart of Cedarling, right? Like it's that you have to look at a whole set of metadata, like you say. I don't know if it's technically metadata or what that is, but conditions, right, that you can look at before accessing. That's all happening, right, in a policy decision point that lives embedded in an application, right?
Right.
Right.
Right. We're jumping ahead a little bit.
Yeah.
Let me. I'll continue. So we set up the problem here of
Oh, I'm
like,
sorry.
okay,
I
companies
think
are really struggling with.
all right.
I mean, it's so funny because we could talk about all the challenges here probably for the next hour. Um, but yeah, there's real authorization challenges here, and so what we did about it, our initial challenge was really real-time authorization. You'll see our website still has some jargon about this, but how do we invalidate a token and know that this transaction will be immediately revoked? That was one of our big challenges. So we actually built a product last year around OPA, Open Policy Agent, and we were pushing data into OPA, and we were able to affect our real-time policies. And it was kind of working, but we felt, and this model is actually well known. Netflix did a presentation at KubeCon about it, and the idea is basically you stream a data pipeline into OPA. OPA has a data API, and you're able to make real-time decisions. We could do that real-time revocation, but we saw this as having a couple of challenges. Challenge number one is it consumed too much resource. Challenge number two is it's really hard to keep those data pipelines up. It's shipping around a lot of data. There's a lot of privacy issues. So we eventually started looking for new solutions, and we got interested in Cedar, and we actually surveyed sort of a number of the solutions out there, and we decided that Cedar, it had some of the latency and size, memory footprint properties that we liked, and we felt that it offered a nice compromise in terms of it was deterministic, but still expressive. So we sort of circled on Cedar, and we assembled a team of Rust developers. We're Java guys, or we had been only Java Python guys, and just doing Rust was a whole new thing for us. So we assembled a Rust team, and we built this thing called the Cedarling. And the Cedarling is an embeddable PDP that wraps the Cedar engine with some more stuff that you need to actually make it usable if you're a developer. Things like logging, things like validating JWTs, things like mapping data from JWT tokens into Cedar entities so you could express Cedar policies about it. So the Cedarling, it's powered by the Rust engine, but it's a sort of includes like 3 or 4 other subsystems that make it usable. We also built, what we found was that writing Cedar policies, although they say it has ergonomic syntax, an auditor can read it without knowing anything about Cedar and kind of get the gist of like what these policies are saying. But it's still hard to write it. So the second part of the solution was we built an authoring tool called Agama Lab to build a Cedar policy store. And then the third part is, okay, now you can express your policies or enforce your policies in your mobile app or your website. You can author your policies, but we needed the third part, which is the enterprise piece, which collects all the logs and creates a comprehensive decision log that would enable to feed your intrusion detection system. So maybe we could actually keep some of these hackers out. And just to wrap it up, where we are today is we've released part 1 and part 2. So we released MVPs of the Cedarling and the Agama Lab policy authoring site. And part 3, we're going to release hopefully sometime in January. That's what we call the lock server. And that can run either standalone or as part of auth server. And the lock server collects the logs. It monitors telemetry. It also can publish the policy store in a more secure way that generates a chain of custody of delivery of the policies. And then along the way we've actually gotten a lot of insights, and we've created sort of some lists of new optimizations and new features we can build into the Cedarling in the future. We believe it's usable now, but we still have a lot to do. This is really just the MVP release. So,
speaking of which, let's look out over 2025, let's say, and the releases you're thinking of doing. Who is it that is originally or initially going to be really wanting Cedarling, right? So, like, what kind of applications, what kind of developers do you foresee really using this framework?
Yeah. So interestingly, in the identity market has really evolved a lot, and enterprise identity today is like really dominated by Microsoft and Okta and Google. And so our niche at Glue are customers who operate their own infrastructure, who have economies of scale. Sometimes I say like too big for Okta. We're good at that. And but of that group, so if you look at our 2025 like leads, 80% of them are banks, overseas banks. So we're definitely very focused on finance and banking and transactions and payments. Healthcare would be number two. Actually, can this person see this health record? That's actually a big challenge in the healthcare industry. So I would say healthcare number two, government maybe number three. I would say payments is really like this is really needed for payments. And weirdly, on the authentication stuff, um, there's a lot of new technologies with passkeys. Um, and so a lot of wallet applications, how you authenticate to the wallet is really important.
Right.
And so we see a lot of growth in that area too.
And so one thing that struck me is that what you're listing are also those areas where you really do need firm, reliable, and safe policies, right? That you can't. It's very specific to a very individual action in an app, right? It's not just
Yeah.
like you have access to this set of documents somewhere. Right?
One of the sexiest parts of Cedar is the amount of work that they've done on sort of the formal reasoning to prove that Cedar has no corner cases. For certain customers like Amazon, for Amazon, if you have access to, if there's a corner case, you might get free S3 buckets or free compute. So those identifying those corner cases is super important to them. And also to be able to do formal reasoning. So at runtime, we want to know, can this person do this action on this resource with this context? However, from a governance perspective, we want to be able to ask other questions like, who can do this action on this resource? And so in order to be able to know that you can back into these types of other questions, the strong scientific formal reasoning background of Cedar is helpful. What I would say is that most of our enterprise customers at Glue are really just struggling with externalizing policies and sort of getting to the first level of building a policy management infrastructure at their enterprise. And they haven't gotten to what happens if there are corner cases, because policy 400 has a conflicting policy with policy 700, and it comes with these weird results. But as the number, the promise is that if you are able to get economies of scale in sort of defining a lot of your infrastructure using this very formal mechanism, that you will be able to sort of identify ahead of time these potential conflicts and also answer some other important questions about security in order to do forensic analysis.
Doesn't Glue, or I should say a fingerling through Cedar, also help you avoid creating conflicting policies or overlapping policies?
Right.
Yeah.
That's a really good question. And actually, so sometimes I remember Roland Hedberg, Swedish Federation programmer, used to say, I don't understand a protocol until I implement it. Sometimes you see gets these insights in the process of implementation. And one of the insights I got was, so Cedar allows you to define a formal set of schema. So a URL, for example, might have a scheme like HTTP or HTTPS. It might have a domain. It might have a path. It might have a fragment. And so in the Cedar architecture, you can actually break apart all these different parts, pieces, and then make policies on them. And so it's very granular. Um, and what you're able to do is if you define your schema against your business model, you're able to validate your policies. So Cedar has a validator data where Cedar will tell you no policy violates the schema, and you will know for 100% that any data you put through these policies should be okay.
Mm-hmm.
However, the insight I have recently gotten is that Cedar doesn't force you to validate the schema.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to risk runtime errors, you can just automatically map that JSON object into a Cedar object and make policy on it. But then there could always be the possibility that you're expecting to get back a certain key or claim that didn't come back, and now Cedar's throwing a unknown error on it. So depending upon how rigorous you want to be in the policy management side, you can either be very loose and run those risks, or you can be sort of very formalized and say, I want to know for 100% sure that I have low latency in my policy evaluation, and I won't get any weird errors. And this is where it also sort of branches from Rego, because Rego, as a programming language, and Rego potentially could have an infinite loop. And so you can't do an analysis of a Rego policy and guarantee that it will ever return. So some customers who really want to know for sure, like in RBAC, they could always tell, did this person have this role? RBAC was deterministic. Some customers having a more deterministic set of policies is an important attribute for them.
Yeah, that actually kind of leads me to a question I've been meaning to ask you, which is, we clearly the performance stuff makes a lot of sense. Obviously, this thing is going to be very highly performant, right? And sub-millisecond kind of response times, that kind of thing. I think we're saying, fine. But what sorts of things can you do, right, with Cedarling? What is Cedarling sort of unlocking, right, in terms of capabilities? In addition to just being, quicker. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
One right there, which is, you mentioned, how RBAC can be a little different from,
yeah.
How these policies are computed, and what sorts of, if then else kinds of capabilities.
Some people would say that Cedarling is a kind of ABAC. I don't think that that's completely inaccurate, because it really combines RBAC and ABAC, because I think about it a little bit like a database query. The RBAC part is the index part. So you can do index searches, like saying, is user enroll? That evaluates super fast. And
Right.
So the idea is we can optimize our query and check our RBAC policies first. And then after we've sort of trimmed our data through RBAC, we can apply ABAC policies. So I only want admins, but I also want region equals, France.
Okay.
And so, but my thought, and I don't think everyone agrees with me on this, but I think Cedar, sometimes when you put two things together, and I think Cedar not only puts together these things, but also has some other properties, that you get something entirely different. So my opinion is we should be calling this CBAC, Cedar-Based Access Control, because yes, it's RBAC and ABAC. However, it's a specific implementation of ABAC, whereas ABAC might otherwise be sort of squishy, what it is. And also the fact that Cedar also comes with an engine. The Cedar engine is very interesting because it's an open source Rust engine that is built and tested and released by Amazon through a very good process. And that Cedar engine is what enables us to build out a PDP that will run in the browser or in a mobile app. So we're talking about much more strict constraints in terms of memory usage. Like we wanted to run in like maybe 3 megs. Like if you're downloading a chunk of like the Cedarling to your browser, that's got to be as small as possible. So we think that you know it's like if you put peanut butter and bread together, you have a sandwich. But if you put peanut butter, bread, and jelly together, you have a PB and J. So sometimes assembling the things in a new way gives you something different. And I think Cedar should be carved out because it is just so revolutionary in its approach.
So CBAC, I like that.
Yeah,
C-
I wish there was a B back because then I could say we have A back, we have B back, and now we have C back.
well, just wait for it. It'll happen. Do you feel like talking a little bit more about the logging at this point? I think that's pretty significant.
Yeah. So the logging is actually quite interesting because that's I say that's the gold in the gold mine. Like enterprises, like if their developers could be a little more productive, like I don't know that they care. They don't know what they're doing anyway. But the failures in intrusion detection, that has real business value. And so the log is like this really interesting source of data where one of the questions I get the most about the Cedarling is people dismiss it and they say, oh, I don't really care about the front end because I only trust the back end. But the front end has all this interesting log information. Like maybe a hacker tried to do something 80 times and was denied before they were finally allowed to send that request to the API gateway that you're enforcing on. So I see the decision log from the front end as an invaluable set of data. I also think that decision log has potentially a lot of evidence that could make it very convincing, because so in our decision log, we put in the JTI, or the identifier of each token that was relied on for this decision. There's some information in the log that you'd have a very hard time explaining how this particular log had this JTI if it wasn't you. So I think that there's a lot of ways we can actually trust that information that's coming out of the front end.
Yeah, so that's now remind me where you're at with it, because that you mentioned earlier in the presentation your lock server, for example, and excuse me, with these components, right, are kind of coming out iteratively, right? Do you want to just talk briefly about how quickly we're going to start seeing all of these in full?
So actually, part of the challenge around logs is batching the logs, and we built that in from the ground up. Cedarling runs in memory. We want to be conscious of having a low memory footprint, but it does run in memory. And it logs we have a built-in key value store, and then we have an interface for popping the logs off of it and batching them up to the server. And that part of it, the logging part on the Cedarling is done. What we haven't built is the part where the Cedarling itself will register with the enterprise lock server, do dynamic client registration, and then it will post those logs to an API on the lock server. So we'll know exactly which instance of the Cedarling sent us these logs. So that's also sort of has integrity. And so we haven't built the Cedarling dynamic client registration part. We kind of felt like we wanted to focus on the part that developers need to get started. And that was on the policy enforcement point and on the policy authoring. And we would go back and build the log collection later. So we're very interested in that, but we just, in terms of prioritizing the product launch, we focused on the part that developers use. If I could actually maybe take a quick detour, can I show you the policy designer? Let's try this.
Do that.
So Agama Lab, and maybe this will help make it real because this stuff is very abstract sometimes. Let's see. So Agama Lab is a tool that we use to build Agama flows. These are like authentication flows. We have our own program or identity orchestration language. That's a whole nother episode. But we decided that Agama Lab was already a developer tool, and it would be pretty cool if we built another part of Agama Lab called Policy Designer, which enabled you to author Cedar policies. And so, you store all of these policies in GitHub. So you can either select your personal GitHub repos or your organizational repos. So we don't actually store any data on Agama Lab. In a way, that makes sense because your policies are like code. They should be version controlled, and that GitHub is where we do that. So that's where it is. Anyway, I digress. So let's just look at what these policy stores look like. And the policy stores have three parts. They have policies. In this case, it's really boring. I only have one policy. Ideally, you'd have more than one policy. We also have our schema. So companies, we ship with quite a lot of out-of-the-box schema. For example, here's a user, and the attributes of the user are email address, phone number, role, the subject identifier, and the username. But companies can add in custom schema and create their own custom objects that they want to make. By the way, we also have out-of-the-box mappings to tokens, like ID tokens. So if you're using standard tokens, those are reserved. Standard claims, those are reserved, but you can add your own claims. Okay, so a policy store actually consists of three things. It consists of the schema, the policies, and then the trusted issuers. Which issuers, which IDPs do you trust to issue you tokens? And then what's the mapping of those tokens to Cedar entities? So you might have one IDP that maybe sends given name, and maybe you have another, or let's take surname, and you might have another IDP that sends it as last name or SN. So each trusted issuer can come with its own claim mapping to the entities. So you basically take, you author your policies, which includes those three things, and then you hit this little link, and then this basically publishes, this is the policy store. So you can take this policy store URL and then plug that into your Cedarling. So your Cedarling can pick up its policy store from a URL. So it can pick it up straight from here, and you can go right to testing your application. Yeah, so this was really our focus, to let people start writing applications, start writing policies, and then start testing the Cedarling with those policies. Some of the other things, we've spent a lot of time on role mapping. Cedar has has RBAC out of the box, as I mentioned. So part of the challenge for us was, if you send us the role attribute, how do we create a role entity and then add the user into the entity? So that all of that's handled sort of automatically by the Cedar. The mapping of claims, the mapping of entities, breaking down data and putting them into the right properties of those Cedar entities. A lot of that's sort of in here. I don't know, thoughts or questions on this part?
I was about to ask you about the mapping, but that was a pretty thorough discussion. I think that it's exciting to see that you can take any form, most forms of identity input, right, and know how to deal with that in your own policy.
I'll give you. I'll take the bait and dive in a little deeper here. I know this is going to be hard for people to see on their little screens. One of the interesting things we did in the mapping is, let's say, the IDP gives you back email, and that just comes back as a string, the email address. Mm-hmm. But that actually, maybe you want to make a policy that says, I only want to let users at this domain log in. Mm-hmm. Well, Cedar allows you to separate. So we do some automatic parsing here, where we can use a regular expression to basically say, well, an email address is always something at a domain. And so we use a regular expression here, and we use these regular expression keys, and we can specifically pull out parts of the data of a string. So we can say separately pull out the UID and the domain. So the role mapping is quite extensive. One other thing I'll say about the role mapping is that what goes in the log is also configurable. So this is another question, and I'm going to stop screen sharing for the moment. But another interesting part is so maybe you have some special information that you want to log. So we have some out-of-the-box stuff that we log to try and create a minimal decision log, but you might send a claim and a token like org ID, and you might want that to show up in the log. So there's also some mapping around what goes into the decision log because we want to minimize.
You mean actually log the data as it came in? You mean log that as well?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So you see both sides. Like it came in this form, it was transformed. I made the policy decision based on that transform set. You see all that in the log.
Yeah, so because when we're sending all those logs up to the server, if you think about thousands of mobile apps or hundreds of thousands of mobile apps or browsers out there all running an instance of the Cedarling, sending up those logs, we really want to minimize that amount of bandwidth. So we ship with sort of a minimal amount of information that we send, but we allow customers to add in additional claims if they want to send up work ID or they want to send up something else that's already in our data model, but they can choose to share it. Yeah. Actually, maybe I'll show a couple other properties here. The Cedarling, let me actually just make a point about deployment. So the first version of Cedarling that we're releasing is actually the sidecar. So Cedarling is a Rust application, and we wrote a Python binding to that because, as I mentioned, we're Java Python guys here. We love Python, so we're like, the reason is I wanted to test it. I write Python, so we wrote a Python binding to it, and then we wanted to use it ourselves. We felt like we can't be telling our customers to use Cedar for policy management and then not use it ourselves. So the only app we happen to be writing right now for enterprisey stuff at Glue is we're writing a new support portal. And our new support portal has some, if you're a customer with this active contract, you can post, or you can be a partner who's authorized for this subset of partners or this subset of our customers. Our support portal has some funky rules in it. And so our goal was, and it's a WordPress site, by the way, the support portal, WordPress has just all these great plugins. We found a support portal plugin that got us like 90% of the way there. And so we're starting to figure out, okay, how do we actually call the Cedarling from this WordPress application? And we thought about doing a binding to PHP, but then we quickly realized that would actually be kind of a pain in the neck. And then we'd be on the hook for like patching the PHP library every time. So we decided it would be easier to just take the Python library and write a sidecar in Python using Python Flask, and then have the WordPress support portal make an HTTP request for authorization. So just like it would any other sidecar. And that pattern enables us to expose the Cedarling as an authorization engine to lots of WordPress is already 43% of the internet. But basically, there's still a lot of Ruby on Rails and Spring Boot applications out there, etc. So we felt like the sidecar got us a big swath, and then this is also a roadmap. But in January, we're hoping we get the WASM, iOS, and Android out because that's what we're really interested in. But as an MVP, it's actually easier for us to ship the sidecar version of it. And one more caveat for any of the AuthZen people who are listening and might be commenting out there, the interface for the Cedarling sidecar is AuthZen. So, because AuthZen is an HTTP protocol that allows you to make an authorization request to a PDP. And we were saying, well, why are we going to invent a protocol to do this? And so we just made AuthZen the protocol for the Cedarling sidecar. So that's sort of where we are today.
Uh-huh.
And we're hoping that that gives and OPA generally runs as a sidecar anyway, so we feel like it's not that it's sort of in the mainstream that your PDP might run as a sidecar, even though we think we can do better.
Okay. And so you mentioned what's available today. That's the WordPress component, right? You mentioned like WASM is still coming, that sort of thing.
Okay, yeah, let me do a quick share here. So the sidecar is available. So if you look on Cedarling docs, there's a section up here at the top now for Cedarling. And then if you want to run the sidecar, there's instructions here on how to run the sidecar. It's a typical Docker sidecar,
Yeah.
basically. And if you run it, it has both an open API and a configuration endpoint. Auth0 only has one endpoint, so it's almost like, why do you need discovery? But it's going to be useful. Yeah, so you can, and we're going to actually, later this week, we're going to publish a more detailed how-to sort of blog article, maybe on Medium, maybe on LinkedIn, or we haven't figured that out yet, but sometime this week, maybe on our blog, we're going to publish for people who want to actually try this out, sort of a hello world of how to deploy the Cedarling and use your cloud technology of choice, whether that's Node.js or Flask or Spring Boot or WordPress or whatever. You're going to call it like a normal HTTP API that's running on a local port. And then policy authoring is up there too, and that's a part of it, is how to author policies. And one of the things we're going to introduce in the Cedarling is official releases. So for our flows, we have a release process that enables you to create a versioned flow, so a versioned release. So for example, this is version 10.29.12. But another feature is that in the decision log itself, you're going to want to know what was the version of the policy store that was running when this decision was made. So some of the other features that we're working on is not just posting your policy store to a URI, but actually making a release of your policy store, a SHA signature of that release, and then being able to incorporate that release into the decision log. So,
all right.
We're getting to the end. I'm supposed to put on it's 42 minutes, so I'm supposed to put on. Mike, why don't I give you the stage? I think we covered a lot of ground here. Why don't I give you, what are some of your last thoughts here? And then also specifically, is there anything you've seen a lot? Is there anything that you've seen in the Cedarling that sort of looks different or new to you, or is this sort of the same old, another PDP?
Oh, no, it's actually quite new. I think that for one thing, obviously your interest in getting a PDP that's embeddable to the endpoint to try to understand what that does in terms of improvements of the performance, as well as just the richness of policies that you can apply. At the same time, it seems like this is a pretty good way to go if you're creating, especially web native applications, brand new applications, that sort of thing. I think that what we'll see over the next few months is as these other components become available, that the enterprise value is going to go way up as well. Like with things like the ability to handle logging, things like that. That seems very useful for various enterprise use cases, not just, again, for managing access, not just for governance, but certainly also for watching for things like identity threats, identity security types of problems. It seems like a very good set of extra signals and more real times to really look for patterns that might need to go to the security operations center and not just be purely about denying access to a particular action.
Yeah, well, I guess I have to put my hat back on because we're at the top of the hour. So do my live streamer host duties and say, well, so next week is our last episode of 2024. Riley Hughes from Trinsic is going to talk about sort of some of the startup journey that he had and how they pivoted the business. I think that's going to be super interesting. Riley has a great podcast himself and live stream, so he's going to be great. Great last guest of 2024. We've done about 75 episodes this year, so anybody who's seen them all, congratulations. I'd like to invite everyone to follow Identity Office Hours on LinkedIn. We're trying to get to 1,000 views, so if you want to give the live stream a Christmas present this year, follow on LinkedIn. They make it really hard to do. But at the bottom of all my posts, there's always a post to the LinkedIn page. So please just hit follow. Mike, thank you so much for helping to pull this Cedarling launch off. Thanks for doing it.
You bet. Thanks, Mike.
Okay, and Happy New Year to the audience. Happy holidays. And we will be back, I think, January 7th. With a new episode from Evolvium. We're already starting to plan 2025. So thanks.